Don't pull it.
She was sprawled on a sunburned rock, her trousers torn low at the waist, bleeding where no decent man wanted to look, and the desert was already deciding if she would live. Her lips were cracked, her eyes were unfocused, and her breath came shallow, like each one might be the last. The heat pressed down hard near the San Pedro River. Summer of 1886, Arizona territory, where mercy didn't come often and never came fast. Caleb Rourke saw her legs first, dusty and shaking, then the torn fabric at her waist, and he stopped so suddenly his horse snorted in protest. She was young, maybe 21, freckles under dirt, hair stuck to her cheek with sweat, and shame burned in her eyes even through the pain. "You're safe," he said, voice low, because loud voices scared wounded animals and scared people even worse. She shook her head weakly, fingers clutching a rock like it was the last solid thing in the world. That was when Caleb saw the blood. It wasn't where a bullet usually hit or where a fall usually tore skin. It was lower, hidden by the waistband of her trousers, dark and spreading with every breath she took. Caleb swallowed. Because this wasn't just about decency now, it was about time. "I've got to see the cut," he said. Steady but firm, knowing hesitation could cost her life. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength, nails digging in as pain surged through her. "Don't pull it," she moaned, voice breaking, eyes squeezed shut as if bracing for something worse. The words weren't flirtatious, they weren't teasing, they were raw and desperate. The sound of someone begging not to be torn open again. Caleb froze for half a second, because men like him didn't touch women like this unless God himself left no other choice. But the blood kept coming. "I won't hurt you," he said, and he meant it. Even if the truth was, this was going to hurt no matter what. He kept easing the waistband down, inch by inch. He shrugged off his coat, laid it across her hips to keep her covered, then turned his face away as much as he could while his hands worked by feel. The fabric was snagged, twisted, and when he eased it down just enough to see, she cried out again, body arching despite herself. "Easy," he murmured, heart pounding harder than it ever had in a gunfight. That was when he saw it. A thin length of rusted wire, probably from a cattle fence, was hooked into her flesh, buried just enough that pulling wrong would tear her open deeper, and just above it, burned faint but unmistakable into her skin, was a mark Caleb hadn't seen in years. 2 letters pressed into flesh by heat and cruelty. G and R. His hands went cold. He'd seen that mark once before, on a dead man dumped near a dry wash south of Tombstone. A man who talked too much about land, deeds, and water rights. Caleb's breath caught, because this wasn't a random attack. And this girl wasn't just unlucky. She was hunted. "I can get it out," he said quietly, more to himself now, mind racing ahead of his hands. "But if I pull wrong, you'll bleed bad," he added. Honesty the only thing he had left to give her. She nodded faintly, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes, teeth clenched hard enough to crack. Caleb eased the wire back the way it went in, millimeter by millimeter, sweat rolling down his spine as her body trembled under his hands. When it finally came free, she sobbed once, sharp and broken, then sagged against the rock. Caleb pressed a clean cloth down, firm but gentle, watching the bleeding slow. He wrapped the wound as best he could, tied it tight, and only then did he let himself breathe. But she was still conscious, barely. "You run through a fence," he said. Not a question, trying to keep her with him. She nodded, lips moving before sound came. "They were behind me," she whispered. "Who?" Caleb asked. Her hand fell open, revealing a damp scrap of paper. One word remained: Dragoon. Caleb looked toward the distant outline of the Dragoon Mountains, hazy in the heat, and felt something old and ugly stir in his gut. He lifted her carefully, settled her against his saddle, and swung up behind her, one arm bracing her weight, the other on the reins. As they rode, her head lolled against his chest, breath shallow but steady. And Caleb kept his eyes scanning the land, because somewhere out there, someone had burned a mark into a young woman's flesh and left her to die in the sun. And Caleb Rourke already knew one hard truth. Men who did that kind of thing didn't stop until the witness was buried. So the question wasn't whether he should help her. The question was how far a tired rancher was willing to go, when helping her might drag him straight into a war he thought he'd survived years ago. The ride into Tombstone felt longer than it should have, because the girl on Caleb Rourke's saddle kept slipping toward the dark edge of sleep. Her skin was hot, her breathing was thin, and every time the horse stepped wrong, she flinched like the ground itself was hurting her. Caleb kept one arm around her waist, not holding her like a lover, holding her like a man keeps a glass bottle from shattering. Tombstone sat there under the sun like a tired old dog that didn't trust strangers. The street smelled like sweat, horse lather, and old wood baking. Caleb could taste dust in his mouth, the kind that never leaves your teeth. Caleb didn't like being watched, but he liked losing a young life even less. He went straight to a doctor he'd seen before, a man named Dr. Hollis, with a small office off Allen Street that smelled of alcohol and stale bandages. The doctor looked up, saw the girl's face, and his eyes flicked to the street before he even spoke. That told Caleb plenty. "I need clean water, stitches if you can do it, and something for fever," Caleb said. Dr. Hollis nodded once, quick, like he wanted to help, but didn't want anyone noticing. He motioned them inside, shut the door, and washed his hands like he was trying to wash off trouble. Caleb laid his coat on the table and eased the girl down. She groaned, one hand grabbing at air and searching for something steady. Dr. Hollis peeled back the cloth Caleb had tied, and his mouth tightened at the sight of the torn skin. He didn't ask how it happened. Out here, asking how just made you part of it. He cleaned the wound, worked fast, and kept glancing at the window like he expected a shadow to fill it. Caleb watched his face. "You're scared of somebody," Caleb said. The doctor stopped for half a breath. Then he kept working. "I'm scared of burying people," he muttered. That was not an answer, and it was all the answer Caleb needed. She stirred on the table, half awake. "Don't," she breathed. Not the same as earlier, softer now, like she was begging him to stop walking into whatever she'd dragged behind her. Caleb didn't respond. He'd already stepped into it. Then the girl's hand slid out from under the coat. A scrap of paper fell onto the table, damp and wrinkled. Dr. Hollis saw it, and his face turned gray. He didn't touch it. He just stared. Caleb picked it up, and the doctor swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have that in my office," Dr. Hollis said. Caleb looked at him. "You mean she shouldn't have it?" Caleb replied, before the doctor could answer. There was a knock at the door. Not polite, not patient. A hard knock that said the man outside believed the door already belonged to him. Dr. Hollis froze. Caleb's shoulders tightened. The knock came again. Then a voice, smooth as cheap whiskey. "Doc, you got company in there," the voice said. Caleb didn't need an introduction. He opened the door himself. Deputy Walt Granger stood in the hallway with a wide brim hat, a neat vest, and the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Two men lingered behind him, hands resting near their belts like they were posing for a photograph. "Afternoon," Granger said. His gaze slid past Caleb, straight to the table where the girl lay. He looked her over the way a butcher looks at meat. Then he looked back at Caleb like Caleb was the problem. "Who is she?" Granger asked. "A hurt girl," Caleb said. Granger chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it," he replied. Granger's smile stayed put. His eyes did not. They flicked, just for a blink, toward the edge of the coat covering her hips, then back up. That blink felt like a hand on a throat. "I'll take it from here," Granger said. Caleb didn't move. "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said. Granger sighed like Caleb was being unreasonable. "Then you're choosing trouble," Granger replied. He tipped his hat toward Dr. Hollis. "Doc, you do your work," he said. Then he looked at Caleb again. "And you, rancher, keep your nose out of county business," and he added. Caleb watched him turn away, and the two men behind him followed. Boots quiet but heavy with promise. When the door shut, Dr. Hollis let out a breath he'd been holding too long. "You know him," Caleb said. "Everybody knows him," the doctor answered. "And everybody knows what happens to people who don't play along," he added. The girl moaned again, and her lips formed a name. Elias, she whispered, then, barely audible, Deed. Caleb leaned close. Who's Elias? He asked. Her eyes didn't open. Her hand tightened around the coat like it was the last decent thing in her life. Dr. Hollis pressed a folded cloth into Caleb's hand. Keep her out of sight, he said. And don't bring her back here, he added. Voice low. Caleb nodded once. He carried her out the back, not the front, and moved through an alley where the sun hit like a hammer. He was halfway to the livery when laughter spilled from the Crystal Palace saloon. Men inside were drinking and telling stories like the world wasn't full of wolves. Caleb tried to pass without looking, but one of Granger's men stepped out into his path. Deputy says you're hauling off something that ain't yours, the man said. Caleb kept walking. The man reached out, not for Caleb, for the girl. That was the mistake. Caleb shifted his weight, and his fist came up clean and fast. One punch. No show. No pride. Just a hard lesson delivered to a man who needed it. The man stumbled back into the saloon doorway, and the laughter died like a candle in wind. Caleb didn't wait for a second round. He turned, carried the girl to the livery, and saddled up with his jaw locked tight, because now he knew something else. Granger wasn't just curious. Granger was hunting. And if Caleb stayed in Tombstone another hour, the town itself would close around them like a trap. Now let me ask you something. Friend, if you're enjoying this old frontier file, tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next turn of this trail gets mean. Pour yourself a little tea, settle in, and tell me this. What time is it where you are right now? And what part of the world are you listening from? Caleb didn't ride out of Tombstone like a hero. He rode out like a man carrying a storm in his arms. The girl was slumped against him, breathing shallow, face pale under the dust. Every so often she shivered, even in that brutal summer heat. Caleb kept his horse at a steady pace because jolting her too hard could open the wound again. He took the back way past the livery, then angled north and east, away from the main drag, toward the open country near Benson. He knew a thing about men like Deputy Granger. They didn't rush when they had the town on their side. They waited, they followed, and they let the desert do the tiring for them. Caleb kept his eyes on the ground as much as the horizon. Fresh hoof prints told stories, and so did wagon ruts. He spotted a set of tracks that weren't his, shadowing him, staying just far enough back to feel like a bad thought. The girl stirred as the wind shifted. Her lips moved, and Caleb leaned in, not out of curiosity, out of worry. She wasn't just feverish, she was fighting to stay alive. Water, she whispered. Caleb let her sip from his canteen, slow and careful, because too much at once could choke her. She swallowed, then made a small sound of pain as the horse stepped over a wash. Caleb tightened his arm around her middle, steadying her like a sack of grain you can't afford to spill. For a while, the only sounds were hooves, wind, and the far-off buzz of flies. Then she spoke again, and this time her words had shape. "Don't take me back," she said. Caleb didn't answer right away because he didn't want to promise what he couldn't keep. He did know one thing, though. He wasn't taking her back to a town where a deputy smiled the way Granger smiled. They rode until Tombstone shrank behind them, and the land opened up into tough grass and scattered mesquite. Heat waves danced off the ground, making the horizon look like it was melting. Caleb's mouth tasted like dust, and his shirt clung to his back. Around mid-afternoon, he found shade under a scraggly cottonwood near a shallow bend that still held a little water. He eased the girl down, kept her covered, and checked the bandage without making a show of it. The bleeding had slowed, but the skin around the wound looked angry and swollen. He poured a small splash of whiskey on a cloth, and the smell rose sharp in the heat. Clara hissed through her teeth when it touched the cut, but Caleb kept his hand steady. He rewrapped it tighter. Because in this country, clean and tight was the difference between living and rotting. Summer in Arizona didn't forgive cuts. He wet a cloth, cooled her forehead, and waited for her eyes to focus. When they finally did, she looked at him like she was trying to decide if he was real. "My name's Clara," she said, voice thin. Caleb nodded once. "Caleb?" he replied. She tried to sit up, failed, then managed it with his help. For a moment she stared at the scrap of paper in Caleb's hand, the one with Dragoon written on it. Her face tightened, like she'd bitten down on a memory. "That's where he told me to go," she said. Caleb watched her carefully. "He who?" he asked. She hesitated, then spoke like the words were heavy. "Elias," she said. "He kept records, land records, deeds, water rights, all that boring ink work nobody notices until it gets folks killed." Caleb didn't interrupt. Men over 45 knew that boring ink work could take a ranch away faster than any gun. Claire's hands trembled, and she forced them still. "He found something wrong," she continued. "Names changed, boundaries moved, signatures that didn't match, stamps that looked right but weren't right." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen families lose everything to a clean piece of paper, signed by a dirty hand. "I didn't steal anything," Claire said. "I only carried a message, and I didn't even understand it at first." She swallowed, and her eyes flicked toward Caleb's saddlebag, like she feared the truth might be hiding in there. Elias said if anything happened to him, I had to get to the Dragoon country and find the man who kept the other copy. Caleb didn't like the sound of other copy. That meant someone else had been involved, and someone else was already in danger. "And Granger," Caleb said, keeping his voice calm. Claire's face went white. "He knows," she whispered. "I saw him once. Not close, but I saw him talking to a man in a good coat, a man who wasn't from a ranch, more like a railroad man." Caleb thought of the burned letters on her skin, and his stomach turned. "You were marked," he said. Clara looked away, ashamed and furious at the same time. "They wanted me to be scared enough to hand it over," she said. "And when I ran, I hit a fence in the dark, and I kept running anyway." Caleb nodded, because he understood that kind of running. Then he heard it. Faint at first, like a far-off drum. Hooves, more than one horse, coming fast. Caleb stood, pulled Clara up, and got her onto the saddle. He didn't rush his horse. He couldn't, but he pushed it into a strong trot, aiming for rough ground where a follower would have to work. The land rose toward the Dragoon Mountains, dark shapes against the glare. His saddle creaked with every step, leather complaining like an old man with bad knees. The air felt thinner out there, and the silence felt watched. Caleb glanced back and saw riders, 3 at least, spreading out like they knew what they were doing. He guided the horse toward a narrow cut between rocks, a place where numbers didn't help much. The first rider closed in, hand low near his belt. Not drawing yet. That told Caleb everything. They wanted Clara alive. Caleb turned his horse hard, swung down, and put himself between Clara and the men coming in. He raised his revolver, not to kill, to warn. One shot cracked the air, dust jumping from the ground in front of the lead horse. The horse reared, the rider cursed, and the other 2 fanned wider. Caleb grabbed the lead rider by the sleeve when the man leaned too far, yanked him off balance, and drove him into the dirt with a hard shoulder. No fancy moves, just ranch strength and mean necessity. The man rolled, and Caleb caught a glimpse of something on his vest, a small badge like the kind a lawman might flash when it suited him. Caleb's blood went colder than the river. If Granger was sending men who could pass for law, then running wasn't going to be enough. Caleb hauled Clara back onto the horse, and they broke into the rocks, the riders regrouping behind them. And as the shadows of the Dragoon Mountains stretched long across the trail, Caleb realized the next place he could gamble on was not a town at all. It was Fort Huachuca, and if the fort gates didn't open for them, they were going to run out of road. The Dragoon Mountains behind them looked like a row of old teeth in the sunset, and Caleb didn't want to find out how sharp they were. He kept the horse moving, not at a wild run, just steady enough to stay ahead of those riders and gentle enough not to tear Clara open again. Clara leaned against him, trying to stay upright, one hand gripping the saddle horn like it was the only thing keeping her in the world. Caleb could hear the others sometimes, faint hoof beats and the occasional shout carried by the dry air. They weren't giving up. That meant Granger wasn't just curious, he was invested. By the time Fort Huachuca came into view, the sky had turned the color of old brass. They'd ridden into the night, slept in short pieces, and pushed again at first light. The fort sat solid and plain, built for function, not beauty. And for the first time all day, Caleb felt a thin thread of hope. Then a sentry stepped out, rifle in hand, and that hope got tested. Caleb raised his empty hand first, a rancher habit, showing he wasn't looking for trouble. "I've got a hurt girl," he called. The sentry didn't move much, but his eyes did. They went to Clara, then to Caleb's holster, then back. "You Army?" the sentry asked. "No," Caleb said. "But I'm not her enemy," he added. The sentry hesitated, then waved them toward the outer area. Not deep inside, just far enough that someone could help, without making it a whole problem. A medic met them, a younger man with tired eyes and a calm voice, the kind of calm you only get after you've seen too many bad days. He didn't ask for a story first. He asked for the wound. Caleb laid his coat down again, kept Clara covered, and held his face turned away while the medic worked. Clara bit down on a cloth when the bandage came off. Her body tensed and her hand clamped onto Caleb's sleeve. Caleb didn't pull away. He just stayed still, letting her borrow a little strength. The medic whistled low when he saw the injury. "Well," he muttered, "that's a nasty place for a fence to get friendly." He cleaned the cut, careful and thorough, and then used a small pair of forceps to check deeper. Clara started to shake, and her eyes filled again. "Don't," she whispered. Caleb leaned close, voice soft. "He's not pulling wrong," he said. "He's easing it out the way it went in," he added. The medic nodded. "She was right to warn you," he said. "Not unkind. There's a piece still in there." He continued. "If somebody yanked at her clothes without thinking, it would have torn her worse," he added. The medic worked slow, patient, then finally lifted out a thin, rusted barb. Clara let out a breath that sounded like she had been holding it for hours. Caleb felt his shoulders drop a fraction. Then the medic's eyes shifted to the faint burn mark above the wound. Those letters, GR. The medic didn't ask. He just looked at Caleb like he understood exactly what kind of town trouble could follow a mark like that. He gave Clara a small dose of something to help with pain and fever, and told Caleb what to do next. Keep it clean, keep her shaded, keep her drinking water, and keep her away from flies, which in Arizona was like trying to keep gossip out of a church picnic. Clara drifted in and out, but after the medic finished, her breathing steadied, her eyes opened again. Clearer than before, she stared at Caleb, and for the first time the fear in her face mixed with something else. Determination. "I didn't pick you," she said quietly. Caleb almost laughed, but it came out as a tired breath. "Ma'am, I didn't pick this either."